Welcome to this second episode of the Screwtape Letters. In this session, we're going to try and take a look at letters 6 through 10. We left off last time with the letter about war, and now letter 6 picks up where that letter leaves off with the uses of anxiety. And once again, I think this is a really insightful letter. Here we're going to see how hell can make good use of anxiety in people's lives. Screwtape begins the letter by noting that God and hell want very different things for people. God wants people to be focused on and concerned with what they actually do. Hell wants people to be concerned and focused on what might happen to them. And I think you can see there's a great difference between those two things. God wants people to actually focus on what they're doing right now, and He wants people to face the trials that they're actually undergoing in this moment, with the idea that doing that produces both a sense of dependence upon Him and also a sense of humility. If I'm going through a certain set of difficulties in my life at this moment, and if I pay attention to those difficulties, I will not only learn important things about myself and my own weaknesses, I will also come to learn that life is kind of a succession of difficulties, and that to get through it, I will need to depend upon God, and I will also need to learn to be humble about myself and my abilities. More about humility later on. What hell wants people to be distracted by all manner of anxieties and fears. What hell wants is generalized anxiety about whatever might happen to you. Even the chance of that happening is actually very slim. Here's what Screwtape says. There's nothing like suspense and anxiety for barricading a man's mind against the enemy. He wants men to be concerned with what they do. Our business is to keep them thinking about what will happen to them. So you see the difference there. What hell wants everyone to be worked up into a kind of generalized state of anxiety, worrying about all manner of things. And Screwtape says, this generalized anxiety actually has the effect of barricading people's minds to the presence of God. It also does them no benefit either, so hell sees that as a doubly good thing. Now here's some more of Screwtape's advice. Your patient will, of course, have picked up the notion that he must submit with patience to the enemy's will. The enemy here, of course, is God. What the enemy means by this is primarily that he should accept with patience the tribulation which is actually dealt out to him, the present anxiety or suspense. It is about this that he is to say, "Thy will be done." And for the daily task of bearing this, daily bread will be provided. It is your business to see that our patient never thinks about the present fear as his appointed cross, but only of the things he is afraid of. So once again, two very different strategies. God wants us to see our present difficulties as the difficulty that has been appointed for us in this moment and the difficulty that we can face with His grace. Hell wants us to worry about anything that might happen to us, no matter how unlikely that thing might be. Screwtape also identifies an important spiritual law here. In all actions which favor the cause of hell, people are to be kept as unaware of as possible. Whereas all the actions which favor God, they're to be kept as self-conscious as possible. An important spiritual law is involved here. I've explained that you can weaken his prayers by diverting his attention from the enemy himself to his own states of mind about the enemy. That is, instead of going through an actual difficulty and going to God in prayer about that difficulty, have someone go to God in prayer, and then instead of praying, simply be lost in a fog of generalized anxiety. Screwtape identifies a number of other important things here that we want to take a quick look at. One of the ways that the patient can be sort of imprisoned in anxiety is to make sure that his anger is turned toward those most close to him, and that his benevolence is directed to a kind of anonymous and generalized humanity. That is, what Screwtape wants to have happen here is make sure that once your patient is kind of worked up in a state of anxiety and dread, that he then acts out that anxiety by being angry and frustrated with those concrete people around him, his family, his friends, the people he works with, but that he maintains a sense of benevolence to a kind of abstract group of people out there that he has never met and probably will never meet ever. Generalized benevolence and then anger and anxiety practice to those around him. That serves the cause of hell as well. Another thing that Screwtape thinks is rather helpful is those who sort of offer approval to virtues but who don't practice them. Today this is what we now know as virtue signaling. Someone who, kind of wants to let you know that they're really good and they've got these really good thoughts and are in favor of these good causes, although none of that really impinges on their life at all. Here's what Screwtape says. All sorts of virtues painted in the fantasy or approved by the intellect, or even in some measure loved and admired, will not keep a man from our Father's house. Indeed, they may make him more amusing once he gets here. What Screwtape is after here is having people believe that certain virtues like compassion and generosity, self-discipline, self-sacrifice, believing all these are really, really important, and even kind of thinking highly of them, but not actually practicing them. That's what Screwtape is aiming for. The love of virtue, the teaching of virtue, without the practice of virtue. Letter 7 deals with the usefulness of factions, both in society and in the church. And in some ways, I think this letter is actually quite relevant today, given the factionalization of American life. Here we discover that another one of hell's favorite instruments of corruption is creating divisions among people. The letter opens with Screwtape giving his policy about how they reveal or don't reveal themselves. Our policy for the moment is to conceal ourselves. I do not think you will have much difficulty in keeping the patient in the dark. The fact that devils are predominantly comic figures in the modern imagination will help you. If any faint suspicion of your existence begins to rise in his mind, suggest to him the picture of something in red tights and persuade him that since he cannot believe in that, he can therefore not believe in you. Screwtape makes a really important point here. He says, it actually can work to our advantage that people don't believe in us. Get them to think of devils as kind of like something from an old-fashioned world that's out of date, that's not scientific, that's modern. Convince people that because the idea of devils are out of date, that they actually can't exist. There's no logical connection between those two things, but that really doesn't matter, as we've seen in letter 1. The less they're aware of your existence, the more effective you will be. Screwtape explains how social factions play a role in hell's purposes. Here's what he says. Any small coterie, kind of small little group, any small coterie bound together by some interest which other men dislike or ignore tends to develop inside itself a hothouse mutual admiration. And towards the outer world, a great deal of pride and hatred, which is entertained without shame because the cause is its sponsor, and it is thought to be impersonal. So just look at what Screwtape is saying here. Factions are useful because of the kind of internal mentality that they breed. And here we might want to think about, either a family, a club, a church, or a political party that has a certain atmosphere. So here's the way they're looking at the world. Everyone out there is wrong. And we alone are right. They may laugh at us. They may dismiss us. They may think that we're unimportant, but we, and we alone, know the truth. And therefore, we have every right in this world to be angry and to hate them. That's the kind of hothouse atmosphere, an atmosphere of self-righteousness, an atmosphere of ever-growing hatred that can be created and incubated among groups, whether it's a family or a church or club or a political party. And so here we see how factions can be very, very useful to hell. Screwtape also notes that, we also want the church to become a faction. We want the church to be small, not only so that fewer and fewer people have the possibility of encountering the church and therefore encountering God, but we also want the church to take on a certain kind of mentality, a kind of uneasy intensity, a sort of defensive self-righteousness. That is, what we want the church to look like is something like this. We want Christians to be kind of walking around saying to people, don't you want to come join us and be angry at the world like we are? To which the answer is probably going to be no. And once again, from hell's perspective, its purposes have been served. The more the church appears to be a kind of collection of angry people who take pride in being sort of like out of step with the world, and who have a kind of self-righteous defensive among themselves. Well, that serves hell's purposes very nicely too. Screwtape also says that for hell's purposes, denominations serve wonderfully because they tend to divide the church into factions. And the important thing here, as Screwtape notes, is we want the factions to be the result of things that really aren't all that important. And this is where we get to all those jokes, which are in some ways embarrassingly true, about churches dividing over, the color of the carpet in the fellowship hall or the date of the second coming and things like that. What Screwtape wants to see happen here is that the church will become divided over small issues, over, in many ways, insignificant issues, over matters of taste or mere matters of judgment or preference. And that will even increase the perception that the church is kind of a self-defensive, self-righteous organization, which will turn even more people off to it. So factions in society and the church can serve hell's purposes quite well. Letter 8 is actually one of my favorite letters. It presents one of the basic spiritual or anthropological principles that runs throughout the Screwtape Letters. And it's what Lewis calls the law of undulation. Let's see how that works. Screwtape begins by noting, humans are amphibians, half spirit, half animal. That's true. As spirits, they belong to the eternal world, but as animals, they inhabit time. Because human beings are a mixture of soul and body, because we are amphibious creatures at once inhabiting both the world, the physical world of time, but also inhabiting the eternal world, heaven. Because we're a mixture of body and soul, because we live in both the spiritual and the physical worlds, that means that human life is always going to be a kind of series of troughs and mountains. All of human life is going to go up and down, up and down, up and down. So that periods of poverty will alternate with periods of richness and liveliness. Periods of excitement will alternate with periods of boredom. And that's true for our spiritual lives as well. There will be long moments, or even seasons in our life, where our spiritual lives will come to feel to be dull and routine and unproductive. And then we'll have those seasons where we'll feel that our relationship with God is growing and is warm and lively. We just have to remember that's part of human life. Now, at this point, Screwtape offers a really important observation. Talking about God, he says, he relies on the troughs even more than the peaks. Some of his special favorites have gone through longer and deeper troughs than anyone else. And why is that? Well, Screwtape says, we want cattle who can eventually become food. He wants servants who can finally become sons. That is, why does God allow us to go through the troughs, the valleys of life? And Screwtape says here, well, there's an important reason why. God does not want us to depend on the highs to sustain our lives. God wants us to draw close to Him at all moments. Not only at those moments where we feel most alive and most inspired, but also at those moments where we feel most dead and furthest away from Him. And therefore, some of the greatest people in the history of the church went through long periods where they felt as if God had abandoned them. St. John of the Cross calls this the dark night of the soul. One of the things that came out when Mother Teresa of Calcutta's journal was published is that we learned that she went through long periods in her life where she felt as if she had been abandoned by God, where she received no joy from the work that she did, or no joy from the prayers that she made. Now, some people kind of laughed at this, but I think that the joke is on them. The thing that's important is that she continued with her work and with her mission, regardless of the way that she felt, because she trusted God. And that's what Screwtape does not want to have happen. What God wants for us is, He wants us to depend upon Him so that we eventually become sons. What hell wants is food. It wants to consume. Screwtape goes on to say this: we want cattle who can finally become food. He wants servants who can become sons. We want to suck in. he wants to give out. We are empty and would be filled. He is full and flows over. And here we get Lewis's fundamental difference between hell and God. Hell is kind of like a vast, open emptiness that is constantly sucking in everything beyond it. In effect, hell's kind of like a black hole. It pulls all reality into itself because it's so impoverished. On the other hand, God is so full of life that he continually flows over, giving life to things beyond himself. The most important example of that, of course, is the whole universe and ourselves. So Screwtape says, God doesn't want to overwhelm them with his presence. He wants them to become more and more aware of that presence and to come to trust him through both good and bad. So it's not that God is somehow absent from us. What is often the case is that God's very much present, but our hearts and minds are shut to that presence. Screwtape says that God allows people to go through the valleys or troughs of life. Also, so they won't come to believe that somehow that the Christian life is dependent upon highs. Hell finds its final defeat, Screwtape says, when this happens. Do not be deceived, Wormwood. Our cause is never more in danger than when a human, no longer desiring, but still intending to do our enemy's will, looks around upon a universe from which every trace of him seems to have vanished, and asks why he has been forsaken and still obeys. Now, I think it doesn't take much creativity to recognize what Screwtape is talking about here. He's clearly talking about what happens in the Garden of Gethsemane, where Jesus in his human nature feels completely abandoned, an abandonment that he will give voice to on the cross using the first verse of Psalm 22. My God, why have you forsaken me? And yet, even in the midst of that abandonment, still trusts God and still does his will. When that occurs, Screwtape says, when there is a human will who on one hand believes that it has been abandoned by God and yet proceeds to do God's will, then the cause of hell is completely lost. And of course, that's exactly what happens in the Garden of Gethsemane and on Good Friday. Letter 9 is also another one of my favorites. Its subject is the subject of pleasure, and what pleasure is and what it's not, and its role in temptation. Screwtape begins by explaining that the troughs of life, building on the theme of letter 8, the troughs of life, he says, are great times for sexual temptation. The attack has a much better chance of success when the man's whole inner world is drab and cold and empty. That's when sexual temptation has its most likelihood of succeeding. And then Screwtape has to say a couple things about pleasure in this context. And what he says I think is really important. Here's what he says. Never forget that when dealing with any pleasure in its healthy and normal and satisfying form, we are, in a sense, on the enemy's, it is God's ground. All the same, it is his invention, not ours. He made all pleasures. All our research so far has not enabled us to produce one. All we can do is to encourage the humans to take pleasures which our enemy has produced at times or in ways or in degrees that he's forbidden. Hence, always try to work away from the natural condition of any pleasure to that in which it is least natural, least redolent of its maker. Now, I think what Screwtape says here is really, really important. We want to make sure that we understand this. So notice what he's saying. Screwtape is saying that pleasure is something that God and God alone has created. All genuine pleasures have been created by God for our use and benefit. Pleasure, real pleasure, can't benefit hell or serve its purposes in any way. Actually, the opposite's true. The more we experience genuine pleasure, like the beauty of a symphony or looking at a lovely landscape or looking at a wonderful piece of art, the more we experience genuine beauty, actually, the closer we are drawn to God because we ask and desire about the source of that beauty. To the degree that we're awakened to genuine pleasure, we're drawn to seek the source of that pleasure, and that's ultimately God. Hell, despite all its research, actually hasn't found any way yet to create a real pleasure. And so what it has to do is it has to take genuine pleasures and corrupt them. And so the formula here is hell wants people to actually engage in pleasures in ways that are unnatural to them. In effect, what hell wants is not pleasure, but corrupted pleasure. All pleasure has been invented by God, and hell can only seek to corrupt pleasure. And so what Screwtape says is, okay, here's our formula for success with regard to pleasure. We don't want people experiencing genuine pleasures. What we want is this: an ever-increasing craving for an ever-diminishing pleasure. An ever-increasing craving for an ever-diminishing pleasure. What Screwtape says here almost sounds like some form of addiction, where in order to create the same feeling, the person has to get more and more and more of the thing to which they're addicted, whether that addiction is sex or power or alcohol or drugs or whatever. They have to have more and more of the thing, in effect, to receive a less and lessening benefit from it. That's hell's strategy. Now, in this process of thinking about pleasure, Screwtape says, look, you tempters need to make sure that people don't think about the law of undulation. People need to be kept from that reality. We don't want people to realize that life goes up and down, and that there will be valleys, there will also be mountain peaks, that pleasures and pains will alternate. We don't want people knowing about that. We want people seeking pleasure all the time and in unnatural ways. Now, once this mindset gets established in someone, then something really interesting can happen from Screwtape's point of view. Blind to the law of undulation and always seeking pleasure, when someone is going through one of the troughs or valleys of life, they can make this move. Here in the valley, I'm losing interest in Christianity. Here in the valley, I feel my faith to be less and less real, and therefore, Christianity must be false. Now, once again, there's no logical connection between those two things, but as we've seen from letter 1, Screwtape isn't after logic. If you can get people to base their life on feelings, when they go through the trough, they can be convinced that their faith is simply a feeling, and therefore it can be dismissed. Letter 10 is also kind of a fun letter. It's my title for it is The Advantages to be Gained by the Fear of Puritanism. Now, Wormwood in this letter has just reported that his patient has found a new circle of friends. And he thinks it's actually a good circle of friends for his purposes. Because this circle of friends are, as he describes them, rich, smart, superficially intellectual, and brightly skeptical about everything in the world. So these folks are sophisticated. They've, drink the latest wine. They follow the latest fashion fads. They're superficially well-educated, but kind of skeptical about everything in the world. Screwtape says, okay, these are the kind of friends that, your patient needs to be with. Why? Well, initially, the patient may not agree with their views, but he might be brought to agree with them, not because he really believes that they're right, but he might come to agree with them out of mere vanity and pride. This is kind of what we've called like peer pressure. So this guy who's just become a Christian, who's still kind of taking small steps in his faith, meets this smart, wealthy, sophisticated group of friends. Initially, he doesn't agree with their worldview. But because he wants to keep them as friends, and because he wants to be thought of as sophisticated and with it, he actually might come to adopt their views. Not because he thinks that they're true, but because he wants to be regarded as smart and sophisticated like they are. Peer pressure. This process will be made easier by the fact, Screwtape says, that Christians have by and large ceased to talk about the temptations of the world. That as Screwtape notes, one of the things that I don't see Christians talking a whole lot about is about pride and vanity and worldliness. That can all be dismissed as Puritanism. And so here's what Screwtape is wanting to do. Anytime anybody criticizes anything about current fashion, current morals, current materialism, current self-obsession, that can always be dismissed as Puritanism, or perhaps also fundamentalism. The word can be used in such a way that it actually forestalls thought. Simply use the word Puritanism or fundamentalism, and you can change people's attitudes without them actually having to rethink anything in any serious way. Now, what Screwtape counsels here, I think, is really important and also significant for us to notice. Screwtape says that what you want to have happen, Wormwood, is you want to have this young man leading a kind of double life. On one hand, he goes to church, he sings the hymns, he listens to the sermon, he reads his Bible on a somewhat regular basis, he has something of a prayer life, and yet at the same time, he's running with this kind of skeptical, materialistic, self-satisfied crowd that feeds his vanity and pride. And if you can do this right, you'll get him to be living a double life. And eventually, the life of the friends will undermine and perhaps even destroy his Christian life. Now, he may stay in the church. He may continue to be a churchgoer, but that's no problem, so long as vanity and pride have sunk into his soul. Then, once again, hell's won a victory. Screwtape ends the letter by noting that the fear of Puritanism has allowed hell to rescue, quote unquote, rescue many people from chastity and temperance. That is, the more that people can be brought to think that any restraint of sexual desire at all, or any desire for material possessions, the idea of restraining those desires in any way, shape, or form, the more people can come to think of that as simply Puritanism, the more they will give themselves over to excesses in both those areas. And so people can be rescued from chastity and temperance. Puritanism will come to describe any attempt to modify any pleasure or to limit any freedom. And that's something that Screwtape is quite happy to have.